Afternoon and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm John Michael Gohler, an attorney in Husch Blackwell's Energy and Natural Resources Group, and I'm joined today by Megan Caldwell, a partner also in our energy group. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them via the question box. We'll try to answer all questions today, but if a more complete answer is needed or we run out of time, we can answer the question later via email. A PDF of the presentation is also available in the program materials folder. This program has been approved for legal education hours. For live attendees, please report your hours by clicking on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. The certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow along with a recording of the webinar. Towards the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. And that's all for housekeeping items. Let's get started on today's program. As an outline, we will first provide an introduction or refresher for most folks on ESG as applied to businesses. Next, we will give you tips on how to identify greenwashing, which is an overstating of your environmental commitments. And finally, we will provide concrete examples of how you can integrate environmental commitments into your day-to-day business operations, your investments, your buildings, your leases, and your supply chain, while providing ways to calculate the environmental benefits of those commitments and discussing common pitfalls with all of these approaches. So Megan is going to kick us off with a review of ESG.
Thanks, John Micah. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan. So by now you've probably heard of ESG. It stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. ESG are a set of criteria or factors that companies and investors can consider in determining whether certain activities or investments are socially conscious and responsible. The E component of ESG focuses on the environmental commitments that companies make. So that's what we're talking about today. Every company uses energy and resources, and every company affects and is affected by the environment. So the E component of ESG is really highly relevant to all of us. There are a wide range of actions that companies can take to be environmentally responsible. These can include taking steps to ensure compliance with environmental laws, reducing waste and emissions, adopting new technologies, and even partnering with other organizations that are taking steps to protect the environment. So why do environmental commitments matter? Lots of reasons. Just a couple, just to highlight. One is that environmental commitments lead to measurable cost savings. ESG criteria are at their core not financial in nature, but they have a very real financial impact. And we'll talk in a bit about the cost savings associated with things like environmental audits, converting to renewable energy as a power source, among other things. A second reason for a company to implement certain environmental practices is improved brand image and more satisfied customers or consumers. And that leads to measurable growth as a company. So consumers are very savvy these days. We all know that. They have many choices. And they look for companies that are environmentally conscious. Also, a strong environmental position allows governing authorities to trust corporations, which in turn makes those governmental agencies more likely to award companies access, approvals, licenses, permits, et cetera. And that affords fresh opportunities for a company's growth. A third reason for companies to ramp up their environmental commitments is the simple fact that it can sometimes lead to more satisfied employees. We all know that workers are leaving and changing jobs in record numbers these days, and some are referring to this era as the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle. The statistics are pretty staggering. 44% of workers are looking for a new job at the moment, according to the latest survey. So retaining talent is critical. Employee satisfaction is a large way to do that. Just as consumers are super savvy these days, so are employees. They want to work for companies that are socially and environmentally responsible. So making environmental commitments is one way that a company can help retain employees.
Thanks, Megan. So our first poll question is, as a personal consumer, do you pay attention to green statements on product packaging or advertising when selecting products to buy? Well, give a few moments here for everyone to chime in. Great. So we're at about over 60, 70% of the attendees have submitted. Let's see what the results are. So as expected, for those folks that have tuned into this webinar, we have a strong always answer. And at the same time, in a somewhat surprising way, we have a never as well. So I think there'll be some benefits to continuing to listen to this presentation to make informed choices, both on the business side of things, as well as when you're actually selecting products yourself. So the next topic we'll discuss is greenwashing. As a result of the increased demand for greener products in business operations, there has been an increased demand for companies to disclose their environmental actions and the need for added transparency to allow the public to compare a company to its peers. Therefore, companies should be careful to report, track, and measure progress on these green commitments before publishing this information. This can avoid the legal and reputational risk of false environmental claims, which is known as greenwashing. Greenwashing not only harms innovation, since it makes it more difficult for legitimate, environmentally friendly products to compete, but can also leave you vulnerable to enforcement. Silvio Bartel, a senior associate in our DC office, covered this issue of greenwashing enforcement in detail in a blog post in November. But the main takeaway is that companies engaging in greenwashing are facing increased scrutiny from the SEC and FTC, which have devoted specific task forces to this issue. So before, you could get away with potentially writing a few sentences on your website or including some things on packaging that probably no one was going to check, but those days are numbered. For example, recently FTC has enforced against a company falsely labeling the process of turning bamboo into rayon fabric as eco-friendly. The court ordered penalties totaling $5 million against those companies. In another case, a company faced a $2 million penalty for nationally marketing beauty brands as 100% organic, when in reality they were not. And then finally, a $21 million judgment was issued against a lighting company for misrepresenting the light output and life expectancy of their LED bulbs. Therefore, companies both big and small should be aware of common terms and subjects that are vulnerable to this greenwashing. These include phrases in your advertisements and your company materials and on your websites that include language like general environmental benefits, carbon offsets, and then various uses of certifications and seals of approval. Other terms include compostable, degradable, free of, non-toxic, ozone safe, and ozone friendly. And finally, and there's quite the list here, this is all from the FTC, there's recycled content, refillable, renewable materials, and source reductions. So if you're going to attach these descriptions to your products or your processes, you need to be sure that you can back them up. Other issues include the use of absolute terms like eliminate with zero without. And we clearly have some lighting stuff here that goes off without movement. So we'll work on that when I come back. Council can help you evaluate your sustainability claims for common greenwashing issues. We can help draft policies addressing sustainability without overcommitting and work with you in ways to calculate and verify your green claims, because that's going to be important. All this requires the setting of measurable and obtainable targets, careful word use, and internal audits of your claim in progress. So anything that you're publishing, anything that you're putting out needs to have eyes on it to be sure that you can indeed meet those commitments and meet what you're saying. Now I'll turn it over to Megan to kick off the discussion of the first of 6 specific environmental commitments that companies can consider.
Thanks, John Micah. So another poll question for the audience. The question is, does your company have an environmental audit program? Yes, no, not sure. Give folks a moment to respond to that. All right, let's see. So looks like we're pretty split. About a third said yes, they have an environmental audit program. A third said no, and another third said not sure. So let's chat about what an environmental audit program is and why it's something you might want to be thinking about. So one environmental commitment companies can consider taking is to comply with environmental laws and regulations. Sounds pretty obvious, right? We all have to comply with environmental laws, and if you don't, there are penalties. both at a federal and state level that environmental agencies can assess for failure to comply with environmental laws. There's so many examples. One example would be if you discharge stormwater at a construction site without a permit. You're most likely in violation of the law, of state law specifically, and the state environmental agency can fine you. Another example would be if you store hazardous wastes on your site without following very specific requirements on containment, number of days stored, et cetera. You're in violation of the law, specifically RCRA, and the state can send you an enforcement notice and assess a penalty against your company. So there's so many rules and requirements at both the federal, state, and also local level with regard to environmental law that it's often very hard to keep track of all of them and to make sure that you're in compliance. One really great way to track all of that is to implement something called an environmental audit program. And what that is it's a formalized program that your company has in place to discover and self-report environmental violations. Sort of how the specific audit program looks really depends upon your company. How frequently you conduct those audits also depends on your company. You can do them quarterly, you can do them every month, you can do them yearly. Obviously, more frequent audits are going to be better in the sense that you're going to discover violations more frequently and have the ability to utilize certain immunities that we're going to talk about in a minute. So the audit programs serve two main functions. First, you allow companies, as we talked about, right, you find violations. They allow companies to demonstrate a high degree of environmental responsibility. And then the second, which is what I just touched on, they allow a company to qualify for what are called audit policies. These policies are available at a federal and sometimes state level, and they provide immunity for self-disclosure of violations discovered during an environmental audit. So in other words, if your company finds out through an audit that it violated an environmental law, as part of that routine environmental audit that you're conducting, you can then disclose that violation and possibly receive complete or sometimes partial immunity from all penalties and fines that could otherwise be assessed against you by environmental agencies. So that's a super, super powerful tool. Penalties are often unexpected and they can be extremely expensive. We have a lot of clients that are really experience a lot of sticker shock when they receive a notice of violation from an environmental agency and then subsequently discuss the amount of the penalties that are going to be assessed against them. They can be, tens of thousands of dollars. They can sometimes be hundreds of thousands of dollars. The max penalty for a lot of environmental violations can be in the millions, because typically environmental laws assess penalties on a day-to-day basis. So every day that you're in violation, they can assess an additional amount of penalties. So, and then the other thing that's kind of scary is in situations involving extreme violations, agencies will sometimes seek criminal prosecution. So, many companies can't afford these penalties or the threat of criminal prosecution, and they can threaten to put businesses under or even jeopardize its officers in the case of criminal charges. So, not to freak anyone out, but designing and implementing audit policies really is one way to catch those violations early in the process and provide you with protection so that your company is not subject to those penalties. Designing and implementing audit policies obviously involves a business cost, but that cost is often far less than the cost of the potential penalties. So it's absolutely worth it to look into developing one. So that's about the audit, developing an audit program. So more on the audit policies themselves. So if you have a violation of a federal environmental law, there's a program that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or US EPA, has in place. It's called Incentives for Self-Policing, Discovery, Disclosure, Correction, and Prevention of Violations, or they just call it the US EPA audit policy for short. And a company can qualify for the US EPA audit policy in limited circumstances. So the first is that a discovery of an environmental violation must be systematic, and quote, systematic, it's a defined term, and quote, voluntarily discovered. And what that means is that it has to be discovered, as we were talking about, through an environmental audit. And the other option is something called a quote, compliance management system. Both of those have specific definitions. The environmental audit has to be systematic, documented, and periodic. And a compliance management system is pretty similar, but it consists of documented efforts to prevent, detect, and correct violations. In order to qualify for the EPA audit policy, the company must also promptly disclose the violation to EPA within 21 days of discovery, sometimes shorter depending on the law. So it's a really short time frame. And the company then has to go back and correct and remediate the violation within 60 calendar days. So there's, you really have to be on the ball, discover the violations through that audit process, and then work potentially with your legal counsel to disclose them pretty much immediately, and then work to remediate them in order to qualify for the policy. Another thing that you have to do to qualify is you have to independently discover the violation before EPA does. So it's not enough, right, if EPA notifies you or some other state agency or whoever notifies you, you have to discover them yourself. Repeat violations are ineligible, and very serious violations can also be ineligible. We've had a lot of situations where we as legal counsel discover an environmental law violation for our clients, right? That's our job. And our clients often will ask us, well, hey, if you discovered the violation, can we qualify for this protection or the U.S. audit policy? And the answer is sometimes, surprisingly, companies can still be eligible for up to a 75% penalty mitigation if the rest of the conditions of the policy are met. So that is available as well. So that's the federal policy. If you are in violation of a state environmental law, so that's federal environmental laws, right? So state environmental laws, the good news is that many states have their own audit or self-reporting immunity policies. They all have different names. Some states do not, but some do, and those protect against state enforcement and penalties also in certain circumstances. But typically the conditions are similar. You need to discover the violation voluntarily on your own through some sort of formalized audit process. So think about whether an audit program might make sense for your company, or if you already have one, it'd be good to think about ways to improve it. Another thing that's helpful is to prepare reports based on what you find. It's not required, but it's helpful, because then you can take those reports to your, someone like your legal counsel and have them to review it to determine if any of the findings do in fact constitute violations that may be eligible for the audit policies. And then the counsel can help assist you in self-reporting to the agency, and then possibly negotiating reduced penalties afforded by the policies. So really powerful tool that a lot of people are not aware of, and really, really crucial in helping sort of reduce the costs to your business associated with unexpected and really, significant penalties. And another way to show your environmental commitment to compliance with environmental laws. So that's environmental audits. The next topic I'm going to talk about, which is sort of low-hanging fruit, is utilizing renewable energy as a power source. It's pretty obvious. It's one of the most frequently talked about environmental commitments, but a lot of companies don't realize the many ways they can do this. A lot of companies think we're too small, it's too expensive, this isn't for us, but that's not necessarily the case. So one way to do this is obviously to install solar or wind on site. And these don't have to be large installations. You can install small solar systems, small wind turbines on site. Those systems can include battery components for storage. Think about if your company has unused land, roofs, parking lots, et cetera, where you could place an installation. The second option to explore would be off-site procurement options through what are called power purchase contracts with renewable energy power generators. So unlike traditional power contracts, no physical power from the project would be sold to the company. Instead, the purchasing company and renewable energy power generator would agree to a long-term fixed purchase price for the power. And then the renewable energy power generation company sells the power to the market. And then the purchasing company pays the difference if the market price is less than the fixed price, or receives any surplus if it is more than the fixed price. So that's another way to do it, a power purchase agreement. A third renewable energy power arrangement, which is a creative way to do it, is called a behind the meter installation. So what that means is that the power generator, for instance, a large scale wind or solar project, And the energy off-taker, which would be, for instance, a company that needs power, they're both of those entities are behind the same interconnection point to the power grid. So the energy transfer from the generator and the off-taker, the transfer between those two parties, occurs before the energy hits the grid. It never reaches the grid and transfers behind the meter. It's all behind the meter. So in these arrangements, the generator selects an off-taker at a fixed price and can negotiate beneficial terms with that off-taker. And the off-taker, in turn, avoids transmission charges because they're not pulling power from the grid. So this arrangement's becoming much more common, in particular in states like Texas. We're seeing it a lot, and it's a really good way if you have, if you have a need for a large amount of energy, a large amount of power, this is a good way to obtain your power from a renewable source. So bottom line is companies of all sizes can utilize renewable energy. You don't have to use wind and solar, obviously, for all of your power needs. It can be just a part of it. It can offset some of your needs. And there's, sort of two main, I think, pretty obvious benefits. One of them saves you money in the long run, and two, it's great for improving your image externally. So lots of benefits there. I will turn it back over to John Micah to talk more about this topic.
Thanks, Megan. The next area is carbon emissions. So like Megan was saying, that the investing in renewable energy or in energy efficiency technologies can be a big leap for a company, but it can also reap tremendous benefits. And calculating and appropriately publicizing those benefits is what calculating carbon emissions can do. There are various tools to help calculate the associated carbon emissions reductions that can accurately publicize these efforts. One of these calculation tools includes the Internal Performance Measurement and Verification Protocol. This tool is valuable because energy demand, water use, and greenhouse gas emissions are difficult to calculate because savings represent the absence of energy consumption or the reduction in demand. Therefore, this tool measures consumption or demand before and then after the implementation or investment in a renewable energy technology or energy efficiency upgrade. Another popular calculator tool that companies can deploy to publish their results is the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Equivalencies Calculator. This allows companies to convert emissions or energy data to the equivalent amount of carbon dioxide emissions saved. Specifically, the calculator helps you translate abstract measurements, like the amount of megawatts that a power plant produces, that a renewable energy project produces, into concrete terms customers and investors can understand, such as the annual emissions from cars, households, or power plants. For example, if you invest in a 50 megawatt solar project, this can save 36 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year. Putting it another way, almost 40,000 pounds of coal burned, or enough electricity to power 7 homes for 1 year, in the equivalent amount of carbon sequestered by 42 acres of forests. These are all ways that you can publicize your efforts and make sure that you're getting the credit externally for your investments. But keep in mind that green investments don't need to be at the scale of renewable energy projects. Making your buildings more efficient can help address a 40% contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. And that'll lead right into our next topic, which is green design and smart products. Specifically, building retrofits and certifications present an actionable source of energy efficiency, emissions reductions, and cost savings. However, companies should avoid overcommitting themselves or publicizing specific building emissions reduction targets unless they can track and meet those goals. This loops us back to the greenwashing issue. For building retrofits, companies can implement real-time monitoring techniques that adjust building conditions to save money and reduce energy use. Companies can also make heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, or HVAC, also known as HVAC upgrades. They can employ weatherization techniques that includes insulation and making sure that all surfaces and windows are sealed, and make insulation and lighting upgrades. It's important to remember that building upgrades are not limited to the interior in this context. Companies can also explore exterior design improvements like water-efficient features, irrigation controls, and drought-resistant landscaping. These improvements, both inside and outside, can lower your maintenance costs and reduce the strain of the building on the environment. And this probably tees it up for many folks about LEED certification. Companies can seek the Green Building Council's Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, or LEED, program certifications, but they should exercise some caution to ensure they maximize their investments. Specifically, companies should know that a LEED project does not always receive its full anticipated LEED credit that they expected during the design, and that the significant investments to upgrade a building could fall a few points short of the desired platinum, gold, or silver certification. Therefore, companies and their design consultants should aim for an additional cushion of points above the desired certification level. Though, like all of our caveats, these concerns about meeting full LEED certification should not prevent a company from embracing sustainable design. And a somewhat new area that companies are exploring outside of the certification process is green leases. Our colleague Yasmin Stiggins, an associate in our Chattanooga office, recently detailed in another blog post that these green leases can be tailored to meet landlord and tenant requirements. Specifically, the parties to a lease can mandate that the building implement certain sustainable design components, materials, or specific construction methods. This approach can be cheaper and more widely achievable than LEED certifications. Aside from building design and material choice in green leases, we've also seen a rise in alternative lease arrangements regarding building energy use. Tenants and landlords are demonstrating increased sophistication and awareness of environmental consideration and changing from net leases, which is the traditional structure, to different cost-sharing lease structures. Under a net lease, the landlord is responsible for capital expenditures, and the tenant is responsible for utility and operating expenses. This creates a split incentive, as there's little desire for the landlord to add energy-saving improvements because they don't reap any of the cost benefits. Alternatively, in these new cost-sharing arrangements, pass-through clauses help incentivize landowners to implement major energy-saving improvements, and the tenants also benefit. This is especially true with commercial clients that can meet annually with landlords and review the effectiveness of certain energy efficiency programs. Leases can include an amortization concept to stretch out the capital expenses of building upgrades over a specific period of time. Leases can also specify that only certain Energy Star rated appliances can be used within the lease premises. And then finally, sticking to the theme of making smart environmental commitments, environmentally friendly products offer a great alternative to traditional options, but with a caveat. I'm sure we've all seen these when we've done our own shopping, but companies should be aware that environmentally friendly products do not always live up to their claims and can be rapidly replaced with better technologies. This doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue them, but be sure to conduct appropriate due diligence before signing any contracts or publicizing emission reductions associated with these product choices. To adequately evaluate product sourcing decisions, companies should look for sustainable certifications from third parties. This means that it's been verified and that it's been tested. These include Green Seal, which specifies sustainable packaging and limits the VOC content in a product, and an EPA Safer Choice, awarded if each ingredient is among the safest in its class. And this tees us up for our third poll question. As a tenant, either in a personal or professional capacity, would you consider a cost-sharing lease structure? I'll give folks some time to respond. Seems to be some appeal to this, which is good. It means that there's still an appetite for folks to get creative in ways to incorporate environmental commitments into their building leases and into their operations. The next topic is the small scale environmental initiatives. These are things that you kind of hear about that have a lot more social drive to them, which can make a big difference on a company's bottom line and in their overall reputation. Similar to green building certification requirements, lessees can require the building to meet the WELL building standard. The WELL building standard addresses health in the wellness of people by measuring, certifying, and monitoring features of the built environment that impact human health and well-being. This includes access to fresh air, natural light, fitness, and comfort. Companies can also partner with their employees to incentivize smaller scale decisions. This includes carpooling into work, where appropriate, choosing to attend a virtual conference rather than traveling to location, which CLEs seem to have this part down. Companies can make recycling available to employees, offer transit stipend, and bike storage options. Although these are simple choices, promoting environmentally conscious decisions can attract and retain employees and customers who want to work at and support green businesses. This can lead to increased retention, more satisfied clients, brand growth, more investment opportunities, and increased revenue. And as always, the benefits are not just theoretical. It can be measured in the form of pounds of material diverted from landfills or reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Now I'll turn it over to Megan to discuss supply chain.
Great. So the last of the 6 environmental commitments that we're going to talk about today. It relates to converting to closed loop waste systems. So let's make sure we're on the right slide. Okay, so we all know there are really significant global supply chain issues right now caused by COVID, the war in Ukraine, and many other factors. So a lot of companies are not getting the what they need for their processes in time. And if your company is feeling the effects of these supply chain issues, one thing you can consider is to convert to what's called a semi-closed or a closed loop waste system. So a closed loop system is one where a company involved in manufacturing takes waste produced by their operations and puts them back into the manufacturing processes in some way. So therefore, you're essentially closing the loop. And it shifts the focus to reuse and recycling. And almost any material can be used in these systems, and that includes fabrics, dyes, water, foams, plastics, metals, technology parts, glass, you name it. So, doing this, obviously this involves certain costs, right? You've got to implement potentially advanced manufacturing equipment, new waste collection techniques, things like that. But in implementing those processes and in avoiding essentially you having to dispose of those production wastes off-site, right? So there's costs associated with off-site disposal, obviously. And doing that, you're also going to save costs because you won't need to purchase new materials and supplies from external sources. Another benefit of the conversion to semi-closed or closed loop systems is that by using the same materials repeatedly, like we mentioned, you'll be diverting waste from landfills. This is sort of a good, feel-good thing that you can publicize and improve your brand image, as we've discussed earlier. And from an environmental permitting and standpoint, you also then, you're reusing and recycling. So, RCRA is the federal hazardous waste law, and it governs essentially solid and hazardous waste. So by reusing and recycling, you are taking yourself essentially out of RCRA. You are providing yourself with certain protections and exemptions such that you don't have to obtain certain permits and hazardous waste generator IDs and things like that. So there's that advantage as well. It sort of streamlines the process from a RCRA permitting and compliance perspective. So lots of things to do there. Obviously, as I talk about it, it would seem that this applies only to manufacturers, but that's not necessarily the case. Your company can still strongly benefit from this sort of closed or semi-closed loop conversion if you and your company, if you partner with suppliers, customers, and other organizations that utilize these waste minimization, systems. So, these partnerships reduce the business risk of depending on supply chain sources that require single-use materials, which are more vulnerable to external supply chain issues. I think we'd all like to think that the supply chain issues are going away soon, but I'm not sure that they are. So this is a very good thing to do. So That wraps up our 6 environmental commitments that we wanted to talk about today. There are obviously many, many other steps that you and your company can take. This was just us highlighting a number of them, but there are so many ways that you and your company can, take steps to be more, quote, environmentally friendly. And there are so many reasons to do that, a lot of which are financial in nature. So there were a couple questions. We've received a lot of good questions. There are a couple that we wanted to try to go ahead and answer. 2 of them went back to the discussion we were having on environmental audits and audit policies. One of them asked, would a historical release qualify if you caught it in an audit, right? So, and I'll go ahead and go to this final slide. So that's a great question. I think my 2 cents, without pouring over specifically the US EPA audit, the real answer is it depends on the policy, right? So it depends on if we're talking about a federal violation or a violation of a federal law or a violation of a state law. If we're talking a violation of federal law, then you got to go look at the US EPA audit policy. My understanding is that it's the ability to qualify for the audit policy is specifically tied to the timing in which you report the violation after it was discovered. So based on my reading of it, and again, I'd have to go back and check, and I can do that. Based on my reading of it, if you discover, let's say a violation happened 4 years ago or whatever, and you discover it through an environmental audit, if you report that violation within 21 days of discovery to US EPA, then my understanding is that you would qualify for the audit policy. That being said, something else to think about is that typically there is what's called a statute of limitations on the ability of environmental agencies to seek enforcement for environmental violations. So, it all depends. But, if we're talking a violation that happened a decade, 2 decades, whatever it may be ago, the agency is not able to pursue enforcement for that violation. So that's something to think about. But again, we can double check that, at least on the federal policy side, and confirm that that's the case. Another question asked, to what extent are companies extending these audits into their supply chains, or should they be? Interesting question. So to back up, so when you think about environmental violations, the entity or the party that is on the hook or responsible for an environmental violation is the party that is responsible under the law for complying with the law, right? So if the requirement, for instance, is that a party obtains a permit, let's go back to let's think of an example. So an example would be if your company has on its site 1,320 gallons of oil storage capacity on site, you're required under federal law to prepare something called an SPCC plan, a spill prevention, countermeasure, and control plan. And the agency actually really heavily enforces it if you don't do that. So who is responsible for that? The party who's responsible for that is the party who is the owner or operator of the site, who has that oil storage capacity on the site. In terms of supply chain, this is probably a bad example for supply chain, right? But the agency doesn't care where the oil came from. It doesn't care, the source of the oil. They're only going to care about the party who's ultimately responsible for preparing and maintaining the SPCC plan. So, one answer to this question is that really you should be mostly concerned with what your company is doing from an environmental audit perspective. Because ultimately you have to think about who is going to be responsible for the environmental law violations. That being said, it's not a horrible idea to, talk to your suppliers and see, are they doing environmental audits? Are they making sure that their processes and operations are in compliance as well? Because that obviously has a trickle down effect to you if they are being subject to penalties, go out of business, et cetera. So it's not an awful idea. So those are the 2 audit-related questions. We will take a closer look at those and follow up later. And then we did receive some additional interesting questions looks like on greenwashing and on the LEED certification. So we will take a closer look at those and follow up after the webinar. So that is it from me. John, Micah, why don't you go ahead and close everything out? We're gonna end a little bit early today, which I'm sure everyone won't be upset about.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I just had one more. We had one more question come through about LEED certifications, and I think it brings up a good point that a lot of these certifications, a lot of these product certifications, the building certifications, they're not without their flaws. LEED in particular, it can be very expensive to reach those set of benchmarks. It can be something that small businesses or just smaller size companies can't really achieve. And there's some also fair criticism that some energy efficiency upgrades or requirements don't have to be met in order to achieve some of the LEED criteria. But I think it's important to remember that all of these processes just kind of function in conjunction, and that everything is moving the ball forward with having folks be more eco-conscious on things. And what we've seen is you have an increased just enforcement of what companies can or can't say. I think that LEED certification can be something that can be picked at, but it's not something that companies shouldn't consider investing in if it's something that they can truly meet and be authentic about achieving that standard. But that is the extent of kind of our discussion on LEED at this time. And I appreciate everyone for tuning in to the webinar. And like Megan said, if you have any questions, feel free to email us and tune in to the next one. And thanks so much, everyone.
So, and then the only other thing to follow up on is, as we mentioned, so the program, just a couple of sort of housekeeping items. The program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. And then finally, please consider completing our short survey. We do use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. We want to be able to provide you with helpful information. And with that concludes our webinar. As we mentioned before, if you submitted a question, even if we addressed it today, we'll go ahead and email you separately and provide a response to that. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email us. Thanks so much. We really appreciate you attending, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day.